Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic today for this final panel is, appropriately so after Senator Rubio's really outstanding remarks, is spectrum policy and spectrum auctions. And of course, wait, somebody coming, I think? Good to have you. Right over here. And of course, there could be no more timely, I think, and important subject in the communications field. It is obviously at the heart of the agenda of the FCC, NTIA, Congress, and indeed much of the industry. I think Senator Rubio put it well that spectrum is a finite asset, but I think it's also true that there are infinite demands upon that asset. And I think we today can and doubtless will debate as to whether or not we are facing a spectrum shortage or even a crisis. But clearly there are more and more wireless and mobile devices and services being introduced into the marketplace every day, and therefore more and more demands for spectrum. Now, how these demands can be met, what users, either in government or in the private sector, will be impacted, and how they'll be impacted is something that we want to talk about today, and it's at the top of the communications policy agenda. Appropriately, we have gathered, I think, some of the best and the brightest to give their vision of spectrum and their own views on this, and save 3 to 5 minutes, some brief comments, and then I'm going to ask a number of provocative and appropriately equally unfair questions of them. So let's just meet our distinguished guests. I'm going to put questions directly to a single panelist, but I would ask others to comment as they might. Jeff Campbell is Vice President for the Americas Government Affairs for Cisco Systems. He's been with the company since 2001, and before that practiced communications law here in D.C. Jeff, of course, is my immediate left. And I'm introducing these folks alphabetically. So next we have Michelle Connolly, is Associate Professor of the Practice Economics Department at Duke University. She was, of course, formerly Chief Economist of the Federal Communications Commission. Unfortunately, Gary Epstein has had a hip replacement, and therefore he cannot be with us today. We've got two illnesses, actually, on this panel. The next one is that Steve Largent hasn't been feeling well just in the last couple of days. So Chris Guttman-McCabe is going to pinch hit for his boss. Steve, of course, is Vice President, Regulatory Affairs of CTIA, the Wireless Association. And he formerly practiced communications law at a firm that I know and love well. Okay? Good to see you, Chris. And then Rick Kaplan is Executive Vice President, Strategic Planning for the National Association of Broadcasters, and is the association's chief voice on spectrum and innovation policy. He formerly was chief of the FCC's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and also a key advisor to Chairman Janikowski and Commissioner Clyburn. And finally, Tom Tauke is the longtime executive vice president of Viacom, overseeing the company's public policy and advocacy. Excuse me? I said Verizon, excuse me. Verizon. Those V's can really get you. He is also a former member of Congress and, of course, of the Telecommunications Subcommittee. So let's start with Jeff Campbell.
Thanks, Dick. You know, I'm tempted to just have nothing to say and refer you all to Senator Rubio's speech, which I think covered a lot of the highlights here. In particular, I like the fact that he was quoting the Cisco Virtual Networking Index statistics and our projections on traffic growth. And I think, you know, without going into any of this in detail, this demonstrates to us what the fundamental conundrum of spectrum policy is right now, which is that we are in a moment where the use of mobile devices for IP-related technologies is exploding like nothing we've ever seen before. As the Senator mentioned, we're projecting that the amount of mobile traffic growth over the next 5 years is going to be 13 times today's usage. which are already up enormously over the usage patterns of just a few years before. As he mentioned, last year's growth was over 70%. So how have we been dealing with this in the past, and how we deal with this in the future, I think tells us a lot about where we should set spectrum policy. You know, the reason we are able to deal with this today as well as we have is that we have had a pipeline of spectrum available for both licensed and unlicensed purposes that have been able to address the technological demands. We have moved forward in the past with spectrum auctions repeatedly over and over again. The Commission has made more spectrum available to licensed users, and that spectrum is being put to the test right now and is being put into use and is going to be needed just to meet the current demands that are coming forward. Likewise, we have also created additional bands of unlicensed spectrum in the past, going from the 900 megahertz spectrum that was originally available, 2.4, as well as 2 bands that were made available in the 5 gigahertz range in the early 2000s. But just like licensed spectrum, that spectrum is also becoming more heavily used and is seeing a lot more demand. So I would suggest that as we look at going forward with spectrum policy in all of these areas, that we use what I like to think of as a reality-based approach rather than a faith-based approach. I don't think we should pick an ideology or a thought process and declare that that is the method that is going to produce the ultimate values. Instead, we have to look at the facts, the science of the spectrum involved, the current uses, the potential new uses, and what the marketplace is demanding. And I think what that's telling us is that we need both a significant amount of additional spectrum for licensed usages because of the huge demand that's going on there. That calls for things like incentive auctions and an incentive auction process where we maximize the availability of spectrum that is created there for licensed uses that will give it the most intense use possible. We look at government spectrum that is being underutilized and find what can be converted and auctioned off for licensed use. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we can never produce enough licensed spectrum to carry all of the traffic demands that are going forward. We have to be able to offload more and more of this, as consumers are today, using Wi-Fi technologies. Those technologies, fortunately, operate best at spectrum bands different from those at which licensed service operate best. And in fact, we already have 2 bands in the 5 gigahertz range that are currently authorized for Wi-Fi, and we're looking at adding 2 significant bands to that as well, so that we could bring Wi-Fi speeds up to gigabit potential to handle the huge offloading capacity. And if we keep our spectrum policy based upon the realities of where the market is and where the physics of the technology is, I think we'll be able to handle this huge flood of data that is coming onto the market over the years in the future.
Thanks, Jeff. Professor Connolly?
Thank you. In terms of this topic, I think there are 2 dimensions that everyone is hitting upon. One is availability of spectrum for current use, and then eventually, once we've maxed that out, how do we most efficiently use what we have as our limited resource? So in terms of thinking of things that are possible in the short run, moving on to the longer run, some of the key things, in my opinion, are that it's very good the move the FCC has made towards expediting the secondary, the handling of secondary market transactions, but it would be good if they continue to work on that, because that makes things immediately available. We don't have to wait for a new auction. Secondly, we need them to continue working on the auction design, do it as quickly as possible, but as well as possible. I was reading through the specific design proposals, and it is very complicated. So I don't want them to mess it up, but I'd like them to go as quickly as possible. One thing that does concern me in some of the proposals that were, well, in the NPRM put out by the FCC are 2 things in particular. One is related to the spectrum screen and the uncertainty that that's bringing forward, not only for this auction, but for future events, and also the suggestion that we might want to have specific credits for certain groups of people to have privileged status in the auctions, which I think has been shown to be a very bad thing. Thirdly, freeing up of government federal spectrum resources that's been mentioned several times. I'm stealing from Leslie Marks on this number, but she said that of the kind of the beachfront property frequencies that the federal agencies are using, up to about 60% of that. That's huge, and is not being used very efficiently. And we would want that to be, the efficiency to be improved, the NTIA to work on that, and for whatever is released to be then auctioned off. And we can have auctions that will be designed to guarantee that this only goes through if the revenues generated from the auction are sufficient to cover any of the costs for the government to move off of those things that can be embedded into the auction process. So the first three things are ideas more of getting more spectrum online for most and efficient use. And then looking forward, we want to think about, we're also going to have to increase the efficiency of the use of any given amount of spectrum. Usage-based pricing is a way, I think, of creating that. So avoiding a lot of these net neutrality impositions can help with the efficiency of the use of spectrum. New technologies are coming online, policy reasoners, ways of reaggregating spectrum will hopefully help reduce congestion issues in the future. And then lastly, and this has been mentioned several times before, reducing regulatory uncertainty so that we have all the incentives to invest in the right types of infrastructure. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now we have Chris Guttman-McCabe of CTIA. And Chris, thanks again for being with us on late notice.
Sure. And in the past, when I was younger, I used to think if I get to sub in for Steve Largent, I actually get to put on a jersey and play football. This is not what I envisioned, actually. I've actually had the pleasure of following Senator Rubio a couple times in the last 12 months, and in both instances I listened to what he said and saw a great opportunity to use some of what he said as a sort of an intro into what I was going to say. And the one thing that really struck me, of the many things that he said that I found of interest, the one thing that really struck me is the quote, we have no idea what the world is going to look like in this space in 5 years. The reason that's important to what I was going to say is because for those of you that have followed this, the idea that's driven a lot of this discussion is this notion of a looming spectrum crisis. And that phrase, although I have to say it wasn't a throwaway phrase, but it was a phrase that CTIA introduced in September of 2009. We sat down with Blair's National Broadband Plan team, and we wanted to get some issues in front of him, and specifically we wanted to get the spectrum issues in front of his team. So we came up with a filing, and we said, alarmingly, there is a looming spectrum crisis for U.S. consumers and businesses which are rapidly embracing and increasingly dependent on this whenever, wherever access. Went on to call for bold access by the federal government. I don't think we could have thought at that time where we would be 3 years from now, both in terms of government focus on this issue, but also, perhaps more importantly, the idea of consumers embracing mobile services. And so I wanted to just say, just to give you an illustration of we have no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years. When we wrote that statement in September of 2009, there were 0 LTE subscribers. We now have 32 million, and if you wait one more year, it'll be probably closer to 150 million. I mean, it's rapidly taking off. There were 123 million advanced 3G, 4G subscribers. There are now 254. There were 41 million smartphones. There are now 150, and by now I mean the end of 2012. In terms of tablets, well, there were 0. The iPad was 6 months away from being launched when we wrote that statement. In terms of apps, there were 150,000, although I think if you asked someone to try to find 150,000, most of them would have been music and ringtone-based apps. There are now 3.6 million available to U.S. consumers in terms of apps. We were at 89% penetration. Most would say that's a pretty mature industry. 277 million subscribers when we wrote that letter. We're now at 103% penetration, probably go closer to 110 by the middle of this year, so 330 million subscribers. Data usage, the last 6 months of 2009, we had 108 billion megabits of use. The last 6 months of 2012, we had 633 billion megabits of use. And you could go on. Text messages have doubled. MMS messages have doubled. But the thing that shocks me the most, and the thing that I've had probably most significant impact on my life, is what we call the verticals. These vertical industries, the intersection of different sectors of our economy and mobile broadband just failed to exist. They didn't exist. There wasn't M-Health, because we didn't have, really any robust 3G networks at the time. So all of a sudden we have M-Health, we have mobile education, we have intelligent transportation, you can, smart grids, as the senator suggested. I mean, every aspect of our life is now being impacted. And personally, my house in Arlington has been converted to a smart meter. They didn't ask me, they just came and converted it. I've now visited a cardiologist a number of times and worn a wireless heart monitor for several weeks at a time, whereas in the past you had to wear a halter and go in 2 days, take it in, get it read, bring it back, wear it again. I've worn it for 2 weeks at a time and had the readings happen in real time. So when I think of what is smart spectrum policy that Mr. Wiley is asking us, I think at the core it's recognizing how fundamentally our mobile communications world and broadband world has changed. And the notion that broadband is just a fixed service anymore is so overtaken by events, and you just need to look around this room and how many people here have at least 2 mobile devices with them. And so for me, smart policy sort of begins and ends with the recognition that we really do need to work on this quickly. We need to get it right, and we need to move a great deal of spectrum to the market, both licensed and unlicensed. But there is there needs to be an emphatic focus on getting licensed spectrum to market to fuel, not the future, to fuel the present, to make sure we provide the foundation for not what's going to happen, but what actually is happening. Because as the senator said, I don't think any of us can predict what the next 5 years are going to look like. But I certainly know what today looks like. And I don't see a pipeline to ensuring today's experiences 5 years from now, let alone what the intelligent people, in the United States will come up with over the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Rick Kaplan is next of the NAB.
Thanks, Dick. It's interesting. I had a totally different read on the senator's speech, unsurprisingly, Chris. When he said, we have no idea what the next 5 years will look like, that actually gave me quite a bit of pause. And to realize that the tablets and smartphones that we didn't know about 5 years ago, I don't know what's next. So when you think about spectrum policy, I don't think about rushing to give every last megahertz to the commercial wireless industry. I think about how do we think about spectrum policy in general? I think about efficient use. And that means government spectrum. It means freeing up government spectrum. It means looking at the various uses, commercial, non-commercial, licensed, unlicensed, across the board. And that's what spectrum policy should be about, not what the flavor of the month is, not what can we move one service to another. I mean, I know people call it flexible use, but it's really for commercial wireless use. But I think that's how we have to look. We have to take the long view. And what's so funny is I think about all the incredible innovations the wireless industry has given us, and it's really been remarkable. But that's all happened with the spectrum we have today. And it wasn't on the promise of more spectrum in the future. It's on spectrum that we have today, and more spectrum that's coming online. And according to the FCC, more than almost any other country in the world. So we're in great shape. I think that's very important. And I think for this crowd, the most notable thing that's happened, and the most exciting thing I think in the wireless industry that's happened, is, as Chris said, it's not yet a fully mature industry. It's still pretty new, and the incredible innovations it's brought in that short time is pretty amazing. But in just really the last year alone, the market has made such a major difference in terms of spectrum policy, which is one reason I often urge caution when thinking about spectrum. So in 2007, when the iPhone came online, it was revolutionary and really led to a lot of incredible things. The key thing about the iPhone was not just the great rise in data, but it was the surprise of the wireless companies who were giving us these new applications and new services that, wow, suddenly this demand from data skyrocketed. It wasn't in anybody's plans. It's not a fault of the wireless industry. It was an incredible innovation. The industry then had to account for that. They had to figure it out. And in that time, it wasn't about new spectrum coming online that allowed them to figure it out. But I think for those of you out there, and this fits in well with the Free State Foundation and its mission, this should be item number one when anyone talks about where the market can work. because here it actually really worked to solve a hard problem where the government didn't actually need to step in. Not that, again, for smart spectrum policy, we don't need to be as efficient as possible. We certainly do. But this is a place actually where the market, with a number of very specific deals that have happened even in just the last 6 months, has accounted for the very real spectrum needs that the wireless industry had. You had Verizon, and Tom could talk about this, their great deal they made with Comcast and the other cable companies to take spectrum that was sitting on the sidelines and, hopefully in the next, 5 or so years really get that fully to use to add to its already considerable spectrum resources. AT&T has done a great job working with the FCC to free up the WCS band, which had really been sitting on the sidelines for a long time, due to rule changes and smart acquisitions by AT&T, including also their deal with Verizon to get more spectrum in 700 megahertz. These are great deals they've had that will allow them to bring the services they need to bring. I see T-Mobile sitting out there too, behind Bob, and they just they're happy because they just got their deal with Metro PCS done, and which allows them to be more spectrally efficient. And Sprint, I don't think we can count how high the amount of spectrum they're going to have if they get Clearwire on top of what they already have as part of their fully owned stockpile. So it's not saying that all the problems are gone, but it's to say that if you give the market a chance to work, it actually can work, whether it's through greater efficiencies. I'm not going to touch that because we only have a short amount of time, but also just through a rationalization of the industry, which wasn't using, as an industry structure matter, which, wasn't addressed in the broadband plan, is a major feature of how you think about efficient use of spectrum. So that's just something to keep in mind. I wanted to introduce that in the conversation. I think it's an important piece. And again, none of that's in lieu of really looking long term at all of our spectrum and freeing up some more federal spectrum, looking at, but there's still a lot of privately held spectrum like that Dish has, 40 megahertz of great spectrum sitting on the sidelines. So it's really taking a holistic look at it. And I think that will be helpful for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick. And finally, we have Tom Tauke of Yes, Verizon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the second time in 5 days that I've heard Senator Rubio speak on a substantive matter. And I have to say he's really raising the bar for other senators. You'd almost think he was a member of the House. Now, Randy has been peppering us with Yogi Berra quotes today. My favorite Yogi Berra quote has absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand. But when asked why he didn't stay in a more expensive hotel, he said, "The towels are so thick, it's hard to close a suitcase." That's my favorite, but the more relevant one today is probably you have to be careful, very careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. And of course, if we don't know where we're going, it is sometimes a challenge to get there, and that is one of the challenges that we face in communications policy. I think that Senator Rubio and Michael Powell were both very articulate on a topic that is sort of a theme today, that we have policies that are outmoded. In fact, I think we could say that a summary of the three panels that we will have today could be on broadband, video, and spectrum could be this. The statute that governs the broadband, video, and spectrum areas is outmoded, outdated, obsolete. The FCC and the other agencies of government are trying hard to work within that statute, but they are working at a real handicap because the fundamental policy of the nation is obsolete. It's not relevant, or it's not up to date with what's going on in the modern world. Senator Rubio said the world is going wireless, and I thought when I saw these driverless cars actually working that I had seen it all, and this might be the ultimate use of wireless. Then this week in Congress we hear testimony about the mini drones the size of an insect that will be able to follow you around all over and record all this information, very scary by the way, record all this information about where you are, what you're doing, and compile it with what you do online, and get this amazing profile. I guess the bottom line is that we know that there is going to be an amazing continued explosion in the amount of data that is communicated over networks, that is stored, that is computed over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And in order to do that, you need, at least as I see it, three things: amazing technological advancement, you need investment in all this infrastructure, but you also need spectrum. You need spectrum, and that's really our topic today. Now, the secondary markets, the developments in secondary markets, such as what we did with Comcast and the other things you mentioned, Rick, are all very encouraging, and they are happening. It's very encouraging to see even what the chairman of the FCC has done with the recommendation to the FCC on the 755 and 2155 bands of spectrum, trying to get that auction going before the end of next year. But I think it is fair to say that even with all these advancements, that we know that we are going to face something of a crunch over the next several years, and the problem is that you have to plan way ahead. Our track record of getting spectrum available, from the time you think about it to the time it's actually available, the track record is it takes 10 to 15 years. I think the earliest we have is about 7 or 8, but generally it's 10 to 15 years from the time you think you're going to start until the time you get it done. So we have to be thinking now about 2025 and what the needs are going to be then. The needs are going to be for licensed spectrum, but they're also going to be for unlicensed spectrum. And so, as Al Capone said when it came to banks, when it comes to spectrum, you have to go where the spectrum is, and the spectrum is with the government. And the only modification I'd make to Senator Rubio's comments are these. First, we haven't had any clear direction from the President or clear direction from Congress in this area for a very long time. No one is saying to the agencies of government, you need to more efficiently use spectrum. They have no incentive to use spectrum more efficiently. If they do something to use spectrum more efficiently, they probably have to make expenditures out of their budgets. And they aren't getting any money for that. So it's a negative for them, not a positive for them in the world they sit in to free up spectrum or to use it more efficiently. We have to change that dynamic. That's where the spectrum is. There are lots of ideas. We've had proposals for commissions like the Base Closing Commission, doing something like that with spectrum. We've had the proposal from Tom Leonard and the TPI folks about having the Government Spectrum Ownership Commission that would serve as something like a GSA, as I understand it, for spectrum. That's a reasonable idea. But the bottom line is, no matter what approach is taken, we need to change the economic fundamentals for those in government who control spectrum. My own view would be that it might be wise for Congress to have a rental fee for all spectrum used by federal agencies. That when they use the spectrum, as long as they keep using it, they have to pay money out of their budget every year to pay it, so they'd have an incentive to use it more efficiently. But regardless of the idea, that, in my judgment, is the issue that has to be tackled.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move to the questions, and Tom, I'm going to stay with you for a moment if I can, and that is, how do you assess the progress made to date on meeting the spectrum goals of the National Broadband Plan, and do you think that beyond the TV incentive auctions, what are the real prospects of meeting the plan's goal of 500 megahertz over the next 10 years?
First, I think that the broadband plan was solid in this area. It made good recommendations. I'm optimistic that the 500 megahertz will become available. But I think if we think to 2025, that probably isn't going to be enough. And so we need to be thinking ahead, and we need to find more, and that's why I think the focus has to be on the government spectrum. But the things that are in the broadband plan, we're seeing them, I think, come to fruition, and I think that I'm reasonably optimistic that by the time 2020 rolls around or 2022 rolls around, that 500 megahertz will be identified and freed.
Okay. Rick, as I listen to your comments, I wonder, do you think there is now or soon will be a spectrum crunch, much less a looming spectrum crisis? How do you feel about that?
I think we don't know. And I think one of the things the broadband plan did not do, it jumped from, which you hear in this conversation quite often, the Cisco statistics, which must make Cisco proud because nothing is more quoted in the world now than the Cisco statistics.
And we love it that way.
Yes, that's right. You should have a royalty fee for that. Not from me, though, I'm sorry. The data, there's no doubt about the data demand. You can't question it, it's absolutely there. What the broadband plan did is jump immediately from the demand to you need more spectrum. And that actually doesn't really address the entire problem. That may be the answer, and that may be partial the answer. But you never, and the FCC has actually no way of evaluating how efficiently the wireless companies are actually using their spectrum. They don't collect that data. The only time you see it is in transactions where the companies fight over who's using it more or less efficiently. And you see, the different models that the economists produce to suggest that, AT&T or T-Mobile aren't using it as efficiently, or Verizon. So that's the only time you see it. But the FCC collects zero data on how the companies use it. So I think we actually don't know the answer to the degree of the spectrum crunch, or if there even is one. I do know there was a spectrum crunch of sorts from the wireless industry perspective, again, as I said, when the iPhone came about, and the networks were overloaded, and they had to figure out how to replan. Do you retire 2G? But the jury's out. Now, one more thing as it relates to broadcasters. It's funny, if there is a spectrum crunch, it's not in Des Moines, Iowa. If there is a spectrum crunch, it's in New York. What's interesting is that same spectrum crunch applies to the broadcasters as well. It's not like you can go get a new station in New York where it actually may be very valuable, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't have room either, nor do the white spaces, who the commission just 2 years ago said, oh, white spaces, here we go, unlicensed spectrum in 600 megahertz. So the spectrum crunch is equally applied in actually the markets where you think it might actually be.
Chris, Guttman-McCabe, any rejoinder?
Well, first of all, I'm going to, I think, download the confession app for Rick that the senator spoke about. The reality is, if this is a conspiracy in the United States with regard to the disconnect between demand and the need for more spectrum, then it's a global conspiracy, because the reality is every country that you would think about comparing ourselves to from a technology perspective has hundreds and hundreds of megahertz either in the pipeline or has already brought it to market, unlike ours. And Rick said we're doing really well, but when you compare our population or our usage to the countries that have brought spectrum to market, it all of a sudden makes that equation, that calculation, look unbelievably disproportionate. And so for me, there is an absolute direct connection between usage, demand, and the need for more. And I think, to take Rick's point, but turn it around, I think that is illustrated in all the transactions you've seen. I think all of these secondary market transactions are designed specifically to address this issue of the need for more spectrum. And I think you're seeing multiples paid on some of these, on some of the spectrum resources because of that need. And so I look at it and say, it's strange that here we are multiple years removed from when we first brought up this issue, that we're still debating whether there's a spectrum crunch. And yet, what has happened in the last 3 years is beyond anything we could have predicted when we were suggesting there was a spectrum crunch, right? There wasn't a tablet at the time. There weren't, verticals at the time. I mean, the smartphone penetration was only at the richest levels of the population. And the projections that this company does all the time, they just keep going through the roof. It's almost like a vertical, it's like a hockey stick. And so for us, the fact that we're still debating whether there's a spectrum demand is almost insulting to the intelligence of policymakers. There is an unbelievable crisis in terms of what is happening in the mobile marketplace and what is planned for from policymakers right now. And I think we have to make those two connect if we want to continue to lead the mobile marketplace.
All right, Rick, a final quick remark, and then we'll go on to another question.
I didn't mean to insult any policymakers out there, I'm sorry. You're all very, very smart, very intelligent. Just quickly, there's a lot of spectrum sitting on the sidelines owned by or licensed by the wireless industry today. So it's not, I felt like I needed to run out quickly and go do something like the world was ending, listening to the crisis that's out there. There's 40 megahertz of dish spectrum right now. Nobody's using it. Verizon has amazing spectrum resources that someday they'll probably use. They're a leader in the marketplace, but it's not all being used. AT&T is still trying to make all the use of its spectrum resources. T-Mobile now has new stuff online. Again, Sprint, unbelievable, with the Clearwire spectrum, which is just sitting there basically lying fallow. I get planning ahead, and I want to be clear. We should be thinking spectrum forward for the country. I mean, that's how we have to think about it, and it's very important. But you know, I get the crisis in Washington line, that's what you have to say to get people to act. And we should be very, and I agree with Tom's point, we should be thinking about spectrum in 2025. But I actually have no idea what's going to happen in 2025. I don't know if these same companies will be around in 2025 or what it will look like. And that's part of the point, too. But just the bottom line is there's spectrum out there now. So no one should freak out after hearing Chris. Like, you're fine. Verizon, your service, your phones are still going to work tomorrow and for a long time to come. Even if you live in New York City and you've traveled down for this fine conference, you will be fine. So I think that's the important thing. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it, but my main point was, I know we can skip from demand to more spectrum, but we still have no idea who's efficiently using it or not, and we just haven't accounted for that. Because if you can get massive gains in efficiency, that's one way to do it. And the final point, I'm sorry, Dick, because this is important, you can't have the mantra of more spectrum forever. So this is actually something that's a moment in time, because it is a finite resource. So this 500 megahertz, or CTIA asked for 800 during the broadband plan, Blair cut them down by 300. I think the bottom line is this doesn't work for too much longer. So we can keep doing more and more and more, but actually it literally is finite, so I don't know where it ends.
All right, Professor Connolly, you wanted to comment on this?
I guess I'm always trying to make people happy with one another. And so I wanted to say that in many ways I don't think that anyone is disagreeing. They're just focusing on different aspects of the problem. And one of the points I was trying to make is supply is two different things. One is the physical spectrum, and one is what is our technological ability to use each unit of that spectrum. And so these are two different dimensions in which you increase what I would call the effective amount of spectrum. And most of our discussions today have focused, so I completely agree, demand is skyrocketing. The demand for by traffic is increasing exponentially. So we know the demand side's going up a lot. However, we don't also know that the technology which is using this is going to increase its greediness at that same rate. So that's a technological question that we don't know ahead of time. And certainly economic pressures may influence how those devices change over time. But to make Rick feel not completely alone, I agree that in addition to quantity, and that's what the government has some option in providing, because the government controls so much of it right now and because we regulate it and we auction it, and I think that's why we're all focusing on that. But there is also the dimension that we may increase effective spectrum by increasing our technologies, and that's going to come from the private sector. So, so I'm very happy in a sense for us to not be talking too much about it, because I don't want us to try and control it. But the reality is that will also help us in that dimension.
All right, Jeff Campbell, we know that U.S. spectrum policy and allocations are bifurcated between NTIA managing the government frequencies and the FCC with the commercial frequencies, and yet we know that the vast majority of users, are sharing the spectrum and between government and non-government uses. What can be done to better coordinate and consolidate our spectrum policy?
Well, it does seem that in the United States we and now I can't remember the exact Winston Churchill quote. It's something like, eventually the Americans will do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other options. And it does seem that we frequently run our government this way. And, I go spend time in other countries and discuss these issues, and it's astounding both how few people you need to talk to in other countries who are in positions to make decisions about these issues, but also how that they tend to be concentrated in one location with one set of powers, which allows for decisions to move forward, when they do. I mean, predicting how the U.S. government will change how they operate, I think, is sort of a fool's errand. I think what we have learned to do in this country is, rather than actually changing how we operate, we figure out it's like water seeking the lowest level. We just find a way to get it done, even while we leave the structures in place. And so I think the bigger issue here is getting as much coordination as possible and as much consensus on what the goals are at the end of the day. And I think, Tom was saying earlier that frequently what really matters here is if we have the people, the highest levels of government declaring something to be a priority, we manage to make things happen. And I think that's what we need to do with spectrum policy. We need to have clear policy direction from the highest levels, and then, the implementation can move forward on that basis.
Tom?
Dick, trying to tie together the earlier discussion with this question, it does seem to me that there's a fundamental policy choice about how you allocate spectrum. You either rely primarily on the market to set a value, and then the user who thinks that they have the best value, can get the best value, purchase that spectrum and use it for that purpose. Or you have a government, and I don't say this in a disparaging way, but a bureaucratic government entity that determines what is the best use of spectrum and allocates spectrum that way. Now, those are fundamentally the two choices. Now, because there are always going to be some government interests, you're going to have some government role here in allocating spectrum, but I think what we're trying to see is movement more to a marketplace so that that marketplace can be more responsive to the points that Rick was making, that as there are changes in the technology, changes in consumer usage and demand, that will be reflected in the marketplace and the price that is paid. And if you do have a robust secondary market, that's going to mean you're going to have shifting uses of spectrum over time to adjust to the changing preferences, demands, technologies of the marketplace. So part of our problem now is that we've been in a government-controlled mechanism for allocating virtually all of the spectrum. And we're trying to move to a place where we have more of it allocated by the marketplace and less of it controlled by government.
All right, now, Professor, NTIA has become a proponent of spectrum sharing, but is that kind of sharing likely really to meet the commercial market's needs for spectrum both on a licensed and an unlicensed basis?
I think sharing has a lot of limitations. Certainly it is possible to do that, but it's going to limit the types of applications that will be feasible there. It seems that it would be more efficient, rather than keeping a lot of it and trying to share a portion, if the NTIA would be successful in having government move its services into a certain group and then simply freeing what's been vacated to full flexible usage by the market.
Jeff, is there a tension between licensed and unlicensed needs? And if so, how's that going to be resolved? And could unlicensed end up being the poor stepchild in this whole process?
Well, unlicensed by its very nature always ends up being the poor stepchild, but that's the point of it. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's the stepchild here, because what it is about using spectrum as efficiently and intensively as we possibly can. And I think this is where you have to come back to sort of fact-based and reality-based spectrum allocation and spectrum policy, which is that, the characteristics of the spectrum do matter a lot. And so when you're looking at, say, 600 megahertz spectrum, and you're talking about unlicensed usage, it's probably not as interesting as some other bands are, because of the nature. You actually get great propagation in 600, and that may not allow for the best usage, at least as unlicensed is used today. Whereas other bands are better on that front. And so I think we kind of have to treat them as two children that we love equally, but recognize that they may have different talents and that they belong in different places at times. And so, I think this is where, you can't just use an ideology to decide what's going on. You can't just say the marketplace will solve everything, or I know best, this, unlicensed is best or licensed is best. We need a mix of the two, but at the right places and the right times.
Chris, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jeff said. I think this issue has come to light most recently, obviously, in the discussions about the incentive auction and how do you do the right mix. And I think oftentimes what gets lost in that debate is there really are two constraining elements to how the commission makes that determination. One, actually, in essence, both set by Congress. The first being that, it can be unlicensed, it can be in the guard bands, but the guard bands have to be technically reasonable. So that's one constraining limitation. The second is you actually need a financially successful auction for there to be any ability to have licensed or unlicensed. And so you need enough money to clear the broadcasters, and I'm of the view, I think Rick's of the view, you know, let's do whatever we need to do to get those broadcasters that want to participate, give them a desire to participate. And so financially, let's not constrain what they might take away. Let's let the market determine that. We also need sufficient money to repack the remaining broadcasters. So those are two, you know, financially significant constraints. There's also a desire, as the Senator said, to reduce our deficit, pay down our debt, and to fund a public safety network. And so, you know, there's a lot right now sort of real intense discussions about what's the right mix of licensed and unlicensed in the incentive auction proceeding. And I say, well, you know, that actually will work itself out. That doesn't need to be a holy war at this point in time, because there are constraining elements to it. Congress set them, and the reality is if we don't have a financially successful auction, nobody gets any spectrum. So you know, I don't think this needs to be a big fight at this moment. I think we're going to work through that.
Rick Kaplan, I heard you give a speech this week in which you suggested, Shock City, that the FCC's incentive auction is too complicated. What are the complexities that you see briefly, and how would we solve that?
Well, you know, first of all, the whole process just is complicated, whether we like it or not. And sometimes when things are incredibly complicated, you have so many different policy issues, so many different technical issues. The desire is to, especially from an academic perspective, really tackle them and find them very interesting and try and figure out the solutions. But in the pragmatic world, what I have found to be a successful recipe is to try and pick the things that are the simplest to get you to your goal. So figure out what your goal is, figure out how to get there. So like Chris was talking about with licensed and unlicensed, you know, it would be great to find terrific homes for both right in the new auction spectrum. It's probably not really possible. You probably have to maximize for licensed to bring in the greatest amount of money to pay for all the congressional priorities. That's very important. And then also, but also at the same time, actually, one reason I do agree with Chris is you actually already have 600 megahertz unlicensed in white spaces. So as long as you preserve them to some degree, you've actually got a solution in front of you. I was mostly referring to the auction design, which again is a really neat problem. But the fact is, if you let the economics get far too far, no, and economists are very important, Michelle, I totally agree. But if you get that too far ahead of the actual engineering, then you're in trouble, because the engineering of this entire process is very hard. So we have to get that right and then build the auction around what we understand, the shared understanding of what the engineering principles are. But it's been done backwards here. You've thrown everything into the neat auction design, which is very creative and innovative, but then you end up with a band plan that doesn't work, or then you end up with a series of interference problems that you didn't anticipate. But you created a great, perfect auction from an economist's perspective, but the engineering didn't work.
Tom, the FCC currently has a proceeding before it concerning spectrum aggregation and possible limits on a company's mobile spectrum holdings. If the Commission does impose those kinds of restrictions, what effect could this have potentially on auction revenues, the ability to fund compensation to broadcasters, and to fund Spectrum Act initiatives such as FirstNet? In other words, if you're out of it, what's going to happen?
If we are out of it, consumers would suffer and not as much money would be raised, are the two short answers. I mean, let me just start this way. We have no difficulty with the FCC having a spectrum screen with roughly 30%, a third of the of available spectrum being if you exceed that, then the FCC takes a close look. We understand that policy. We understand that it is an adjunct, if you will, of a good antitrust policy, and we have no difficulty with that. We think that screen should be one where if you pierce the screen, that's when the FCC takes a look. We also think the screen should be adjusted to reflect all of the spectrum that is in the marketplace, which it does not now reflect. So we need some adjustments there. But when they have the auction should permit all players to come and participate. First of all, players should be given an option to buy spectrum and trade other spectrum or sell other spectrum if they want to. But all players should be able to participate, because that's how you get the best read of what's going on in the marketplace. That's how you get the most efficient allocation. One other observation I'd just make is the way these policies tend to work is they treat all companies equally. This is like the United Nations, you know. Every country gets one vote. You have 1 million people, you get a vote. You have 1 billion people, you get a vote. They don't pay any attention on how many customers you have. You know, the fact of life is that, in the case of our company, I'll just say, people are choosing Verizon. They are every month. More people move to Verizon than move away from Verizon. We think we know why. We think it's because of better network and better service. But in any event, that's happening. But when you have these kind of notions that everybody should get an equal amount of spectrum or something like that, that suggests that consumers are going to be thwarted in their ability to make choices. And that isn't right either. So there is a line between, on the one hand, giving not allowing anybody to get too much, and on the other hand, ensuring everybody has a chance. And we understand that the FCC is trying to walk that line, and we can walk that with them. But I think they have to be very careful not to just say some carriers don't have the ability to participate because of the spectrum they already hold.
Professor Connolly, if you look at the record in the incentive auction, you see that there's a number of technical disputes on important issues such as interference potential, interoperability, size of guard bands, and you see dueling technical studies and claims. How's the FCC going to deal with those, do you think? I was going to ask Gary Epstein that question, but he's not here, so you get it.
Well, I have a thought, but I don't think I should share it. I'll just say that I thought that Commissioner Pai and Commissioner McDowell's comments on the size of the guard bands were very interesting. I thought Commissioner McDowell's comment on doing the 5 megahertz, you know, selling in 5 megahertz bands as opposed to 6 megahertz, I think was also a very interesting comment. Certainly technology is evolving. I am therefore probably leaning more towards the concern that the 6 megahertz guard bands might be a little large, but I'm not an engineer, so I won't make a specific claim on that situation, but I would assume that they're erring on the side of extreme caution.
Excuse me. Well, you know, given the fact that we've got those technical disputes, Chris, and we've got changes in the membership of the FCC, and we've got disagreements in the industry, could the idea of having an order this year and an auction in 2014, could those dates slip? And if so, likely by how much?
No, and none at all. You know, the reality is, and Rick said this, and I think we agree completely. I think everyone up here would agree. It's an extraordinarily complicated undertaking. But so full stop. I believe strongly that we should set deadlines as to and goals and try to set a time frame for when the commission should complete the rulemaking and then accordingly move the spectrum to auction. I've seen recently that Commissioner Pai said that, Commissioner Rosenworcel said that. I think that makes sense. To your point about changeover, we know pretty much for certain that those two will be around you know, in the next year or so. So I think the goal absolutely should be to finish the rulemaking in this year, in 2013, and the goal should certainly be to try to auction this spectrum by 2014. And, you know, we'll work through the difficult issues now. The reality is, at this stage of every auction, and I've been at CTI for 11 years and been doing this for 17, at every stage, at every auction, at this stage, there are a number of extraordinarily difficult issues that still remain and a lot of complicated things that have to be addressed. The reality is that's where we are now. I think it's too early to say, is it too complicated? Is it not complicated enough? Is the auction mechanism the right mechanism? Should it be different? I think, you know, you have to give the commission the ability to actually work its way through these issues, and we had reply comments last week. So I've set for myself that there's absolutely no chance I'm going to look at a single reply comment, sorry to my members who are sitting around here, but until at least next week, just to let everything sit. And I think that's fair for the commission too, is let the issues come in, let everyone look at where there are agreements, where there are disagreements, and then, as the Commission always does, start to knock off those issues where there's, as close to unanimity or consensus as you can, and then the ones that remain are the ones you're going to have to buckle down.
Well, Rick, one very complicating matter that could be a problem is repacking and coordinating repacking with Canada and Mexico. And how do you think that should be implemented? How should we get revised DTV cross-border agreements?
Well, these are one of those very complicated issues that I think excuse me, a lot of people didn't appreciate at the beginning of the process. And it's one that I think where both the broadcast industry and the wireless industry and their vendors are largely in agreement, at least in principle. You can't move broadcasters in the northern part of the country and in pretty big markets where we're about just under 800 stations live within this coordination zone. So anytime the FCC wants to change power, move a station within 250 miles of the Canadian border, for example, it has to coordinate with Canada and go through a process. That won't work with this auction, not the way they have it designed. They need to make those decisions kind of instantaneously. So you have a decision to make, putting the statute aside for 1 second. You can either say, well, we'll just do something different with that area of the country, or you can say, let's figure it out and try and cut a deal with Canada to allow us to move the stations so we can free up that spectrum for nationwide bands for mobile broadband. We definitely think the latter is better because whenever the Commission postpones decisions to later, it never works. It's always a headache, and it lasts twice as long as you think it's going to. Now, we proposed to the FCC 2 weeks ago because they're totally silent on this issue publicly, and I still have no idea why, when everybody said, can we do a working group? Can we? And this is all industries kind of coming together on this issue because it benefits all of us. The key thing here is we have to get working. We don't have to have a perfect answer, and we don't want an answer that delays the auction by 5 years. But we propose something we think that gets us 60, 70% of the way there, and that could take a lot less time. But I think it's an incredibly important issue that everyone now is starting to grasp.
Okay, Jeff Campbell, you think our country should consider aligning its spectrum bands and allocations with an eye to global spectrum use?
Yeah, absolutely, as much as we reasonably can. It is sort of an interesting experience that the world has improved on this. I'm not sure exactly why in some areas, but just on my personal travels with iPhone or before iPhone and whatnot around the world, we've gotten to a point where I can turn my phone on and it gives me at least decent service wherever I go. And part of that is because of harmonization efforts and issues. And I think we need to think about this when we're looking at a world of mobile devices. The devices cross the border all the time, and the more we can harmonize on that, the better off we'll be. We will never get to perfection in this space, but when we have the opportunity to do so, we've got to grab it, because the devices are not being manufactured for the United States. They are being manufactured for the world economy. Now, fortunately, we're one of the largest markets, so that it's a lot, you can manufacture for the U.S. market when necessary. But, how long that will be true, I hope it's forever. But there are enormous efficiencies that come from globalization here, which is good for consumers, good for our country, and to the extent we can lead on that, we should be.
Okay, here's a final question for me, then I'd like to go to the audience. I'm going to ask each one of you to put on your crystal ball and make a prediction on the amount of television broadcast spectrum that will be cleared from the incentive auction process. Will it be 120, 90, 60? What do you think, Jeff? You're first.
I'm going to be the optimist and say 120.
120, okay. Professor?
I'm going to say it's whatever they want to do as long as they're willing to offer the right price.
You're wimping out there, Okay, we'll take that.
120.
Huh?
120.
120, okay. All right, Mr. Kaplan.
I have no idea.
Oh.
No, I think it depends. First of all, it's interesting. Everyone's assuming it's a nationwide ban, which is, first of all, important, which I agree with, so I'll take that as agreement. I think if they continue the way they are, it threatens to not have any, but I think they need at least 60 to make it worthwhile.
60 to make it work. All right, Tom, last word on that.
I think it'll be closer to 120.
All right, very good. Let's go to the audience now at this point and see what questions we have for our excellent panel. All right. Mr. Quinn.
Bob Quinn I'm with AT&T. So Rick, I agreed with a lot of what you're saying about efficiency. So you weren't standing alone up there. But I got a challenge for you and a question, which is, you guys, your broadcasters are using a technology that was created 70 years ago, big stick, high power, which requires us to use spectrum for broadcasting in a very efficient manner. Isn't there a way, what can we do to incentivize the broadcasters to explore different types of technologies than the one that's been in place for decades, to maybe alleviate some of these interference issues?
It's a very, very fair question. And I think when I talk about long-term spectrum policy, that involves everyone, including broadcasters. And I think, well, first of all, one way to make broadcasters be as efficiently, use their spectrum as our spectrum as efficiently as possible, is to have conversations like this. The incentive auction, trust me, when now you're talking about losing spectrum yet again for broadcasters, that's certainly a big way. And that's one reason I have concerns with the wireless industry saying more, because to Michelle's point, you never then force, there is sort of a forcing function that the scarcity does have for efficiency. It's a balance. But for us, I think, you know, we have a number of challenges. One is, one on the positive side, we do have a one-to-many technology, which has certain advantages over the one-to-one technology. Broadcasting the Super Bowl, we'll see what happens with the LTE broadcast. But, you know, we do that very efficiently. And in fact, I think someday we'll be working, I think we'll be working with the wireless industry, because we have a great way of delivering data that you guys don't. And you have ways of delivering data we don't. So I think that there's actually a future that sees us both together. I think we also have a number, you know, the funny thing when I worked at the commission, the big thing of the wireless industry is, wow, we are just the most unregulated industry, and that's why we've been successful. We have to sort, the broadcast industry is the most regulated industry, and I think thinking of ways in which we could be more efficient also has to do with certain regulations that we have that have been there for a long time that have allowed us to sort of be stuck in time and frozen in time. And so those are things we're well aware of now, and it's a fair conversation. I know we're having it, and you know, I think we'll continue to have it to be as efficient. But I think the ultimate answer is marrying some of the two technologies together. I think that will help. And as well as, you know, the last thing is, the commission, you know, broadcasters for a long time fought it because we needed the right rules in place. But the spectrum we're not using, white spaces, you know, that for unlicensed is a very good thing, you know, ultimately, now that we've gotten the balance almost right.
All right, we have time for one last question out here in the audience. Buddy? All right, well, please join me in thanking this outstanding panel.